In this video we're going to continue from the last, still looking at the basic principles of animation, and we'll be focusing on the second set, which are more of the technical principles, which basically constitute a set of guidelines for things that you should try as much as possible to put into your animation to give it extra naturalism and life, and whose real purpose is to try and convey a sense of realism. Or should we say believability, since that also of course includes cartoon animation. The first of these is squash and stretch, and we see here the most commonly given example of squash and stretch, which is the bouncing ball, where we have this rubbery ball, and as we can see, as it bounces along the ground, it squishes and stretches its form as it goes. This gives an extra sense of the dynamic in the motion. It helps us to see the ball, speeding up, slowing down. It helps to accentuate the impacts where it hits the ground, and also, of course, accentuates the little holds that we have at the high points there. This kind of action, however, is not just restricted simply to, inanimate or passive or rubbery objects like that. It also translates through to characters, be they organic characters or even mechanical. For instance, here we see this lamp doing a series of little hops, and of course what we see is his body stretches out here, and as he comes in for the impact, just like the bouncing ball, his body collapses down. He squashes, he leaps off, and once again we get this stretch. Stretch, squash, stretch, and squash, and stretch, and so on. Even though he's not rubbery in any way, even though we are not deforming his body in a squash and stretch manner, the shape of his body is still deforming. This is an important thing to take note of, as it's often misconceived that squash and stretch only has to do with rubbery effects in animation, such as having cartoon characters with stretchy limbs or similar. It's not. It's also about the actual body shape. Because even if the physical body itself isn't distorting, every time a character makes a movement, the body shape is being distorted. This leads us into the next one, anticipation. Of course, what you see when he squishes down, ready to jump up again, is that his squish down is an anticipation of him pushing himself back off. He doesn't just leap rigidly as if, fired up by a rocket or something. He actually has to work his body to achieve that lift and that jump. And the squash that he does before jumping is a part of the anticipation for working into the jump that is going to follow. We see this in other areas as well, like here, a character throwing a punch. We notice, of course, that he starts out in a neutral pose. He winds himself back, readying his arm, before striking out with the punch. This little shift backwards that we have is anticipation of the action that he is about to perform. This is a very natural thing, and it tends to occur a lot of the time when someone or something is trying to push either a part of its body, such as the arm here, or its entire body in a new direction. A good way to think of it is in terms of something like a bow and arrow. The bow must be drawn first before the arrow can be released. If you don't, you just have the bow still and you let go of the arrow, it simply drops and doesn't fire. As such, anticipation is the winding up of an action before the performance of that action. There are also some subtleties to where you can place it, of course. If you imagine, a parked car that is driving away, then the car doesn't do a little reverse before moving forwards. Something like that would look a bit ridiculous. But if you have a car that is stopped on a hill and is performing a hill start, then it's not at all uncommon as you go off the brake and onto the accelerator for the car to perform a tiny little back roll before, of course, the torque and the pull of the engine is able to start dragging it back up the hill. And so even in vehicles you will occasionally see little bits of anticipation like this taking place. We then have overlap and follow through, and here's a simple little, example of a clearly overlapping action. We see that this top item is rotating, a bit like a pendulum, and this item below it is sort of just flicking around on the end. What we see, of course, is that the two actions are overlapped. When this first item hits its high point, which is there, and begins to swing back, the second item is not yet hit its full rotational high point. And so there is this overlap between when one thing starts swinging backwards and when its child starts swinging backwards. Most commonly, overlapping actions like this will occur in hierarchies. Limbs, spines, trunks, tentacles, things of that nature is where you're going to see it happen the most. If indeed you saw the FKIK video from the Foundations chapter of the rigging series, then you also start to see how different types of control system allow for overlap. And you'll have started to get an idea for how we use different control systems there for different kind of actions that either must have or should not have overlap contained in them. There are, however, also other places where the principle of overlapping actions applies. For instance, look at this guy here as he steps through this move and comes across like this. As his body and his hips are moving to the side here, he needs there to be a leg underneath him. Otherwise, of course, he's just going to fall over when his body moves across here. As such, the leg needs to arrive on the ground before the hip can move across. Therefore, the hip is, in a certain sense, overlapping the action on the foot. Very much related to overlap is this action, follow through, where of course we see that the motion of one thing, once it stops, cascades down a chain and into connected items. And so as this little carrier of these two bones whizzes across the screen there, it comes to a sudden stop, but of course after that stop has occurred, the bones whip forward. They follow through that action and continue their motion. The reason being, of course, because they have inherited this forward motion travelling along, but when the main item carrying them stops, they haven't had anything to stop them. Perhaps this has a brake applied or whatever else, it doesn't matter. The point is that the action follows through. And of course, just like when you apply the brakes fiercely in your car, you go shooting forward a little bit, if not for your seatbelt. Follow through, of course, also has this sort of inverse, which is what we see happening here at the beginning of the action. As the carrier of these bones starts to accelerate away, they drag behind. This is still follow through, it's just sort of the opposite way round. Here, everything is nice and still and moving slowly, and so that slow motion follows through into the next part of the chain as the acceleration begins to build in the carrier object here, and of course when it brakes suddenly, this has now inherited the fast motion and that follows through. Normally, of course, you would call this drag, not follow through, but it is basically two sides of the same coin here, and that's what's going on. Also, of course, we can see what we're doing with these. There is similarly overlap that's happening in the reaction there. Overlap and follow through, very closely connected little types of motion. The principle of slow in and slow out is basically an observation of the fact that things very rarely just begin moving and come to a stop instantaneously with a constant speed from beginning to end. More commonly, what they tend to do, of course, is they tend to first of all speed up, begin moving, and then slow down before coming to rest. This is also sometimes called ease in and ease out. However, it should be remembered that just because this is very common and an awful lot of things that you will move around will do this, they'll, slowly accelerate and then slowly decelerate. Not every action is appropriate for this. Sometimes you want slow in and slow out. Sometimes you want fast in and fast out, or a cross combination of the two. For instance, the follow through example here, we see that the, carriage object does slowly accelerate up, but then it's stopping hard. Maybe it's, hitting something, or it's slamming on the brakes, what have you. It's coming to a very, very sudden stop. This is a slow out. It's coming out of its initial position slowly, but it's coming in to its final position fast. Slow out, fast in. Yet another example of something like that would be the punch. Clearly, when somebody's throwing a punch, you don't want them to be, have their hand travelling forward and then slowing down just before the moment of impact. That's unrealistic. This, again, would be a slow in, as we'd go for the anticipation first, then the arm and the body, of course, would begin, launching itself forwards, building up acceleration, and then as it got to the end of its action, it would punch in fast. So we'd have a slow out, fast in again. Arcs and the observation of arcs in motion come from a couple of different places. First of all, with things that sort of swing from a pivot point, like of course, we've got this top bone here doing, well, its end, its tip, and subsequently its child, its second bone here, moves through space in an arc, simply because it's basically orbiting this pivot point up at the top here. If we look further down at the tip of this second bone, then we can see that again we have another arc. It is, however, just a more complex arc. It's got this roll over and roll under to it because, of course, we've got this overlapping action taking place on the two bones here, but we still have an arc. The most common place you're going to find this is in character limbs, particularly the extremities of character limbs. So, when an arm is flailing around like that, the wrist should be moving in a nice clean arc through space. If you've got little, jerks or steps going on in that, it's very often a bad thing and doesn't look that great. Of course, it depends on, the specifics of the motion. If you've got some very sudden, sharp action that occurs to a character, they get pushed or they trip or who knows what, then certain things can, interrupt an arc. It's not the case that you must always, under all circumstances, have these smooth arcs. But, of course, most of the time you do need to observe them. It is, of course, not simply, chains or things that exist in a hierarchy like arms, legs and so on that have arcs in their motion, or which produce arcs at their tips. Any object that is flying free through space, or at least, doing so on a planet where there's gravity, will wind up travelling in an arced motion. It will have an arced motion path. As again, we see on the old bouncing ball here. He's got forward movement as well as, his bounce, and his actual motion path is a series of arcs. And this also holds true in other situations. For instance, here, we've got this dragon flying around, and of course he takes this corner here, but what he can't do is just turn a corner instantaneously. Once again, we're feeding back into yet another principle, which is the notion of slow in and slow out. He has to slow out of one direction of movement in order to slow into another, and continue that, of course, and the product of all of this change of direction, from travelling to screen left here, to screen up, to screen right, is that his motion path becomes an arc, like this. He's not just a free-falling projectile, he's moving himself through space, and neither is he dangling at the end of a hierarchy, but still he takes this arced motion through space as he moves around at speed. And you would see this whether it were a dragon, or a fighter plane, or a car. Finally, with this example, we can come on to the notion of the thing known as secondary action, and if we look at this guy nice and closely, then what we can see is he's got this tail here, and this tail is broadly hugging his motion path. You see that? As he whips around, it's being trailed out behind him. This is an example of secondary action. Another kind of secondary action that we can see taking place on this character here are the different thrusts that we get in the chest there, and also the head and neck as he beats his wings. You see that? That little thrust that pushes the chest up and the neck and head bob down as he thrusts his wings down. That there is a secondary action. Very often secondary action is also related to ideas of follow-through and overlap. Things like a tail hanging off the back of an animal, or a chain dangling from a character's belt, or a big round wobbly belly that's shaking around in front of a character as he's walking or running. These are all examples of secondary action. Specifically what we, however, group into secondary action, rather than just being another example of overlap, follow-through and so on, is that these are actions that accentuate the main action. We talked in the previous video, of course, about appeal and exaggeration and staging. Secondary action is kind of like physical incarnation of that. It's a way of drawing added attention to a certain action which is taking place. It emphasizes the main motion that is going on. And it's a principle even that you can take away just from animation itself and apply more broadly. For instance, imagine a big wide shot of a snowy landscape with a character stood there in the snow and this long trench dug along behind him. What is this, big wide shot of this long trench cut in the snow doing for us? It's communicating the fact that this character has been trudging his way through the snow for quite a distance. It helps tell a part of the story via this little secondary vehicle that's included within the shot. Secondary action in animation works very much like that, from a point of view of communicating the motion clearly to an audience. Finally then, let's look at the principle of solid drawing, and this is the idea that shapes, bodies, characters, whatever, will retain their volume as they displace. For instance, we see our ball here. When he is squashing, he's not just getting shorter, he's also getting fatter. And when he stretches, he's not just getting taller, he's also getting thinner. What we see is that we have volume maintenance. A squash or stretch in one direction is compensated for by squashing and stretching in opposing directions like this. Obviously, this principle applies more when you are working with deforming, squashy objects, or when you are doing squashy, stretchy cartoon character animation where the character's body actually deforms. It mainly came through as a principle of animation and is called solid drawing because, of course, when you are drawing frames of animation, it's very easy for your shapes and their volume to start to slip around between frames. As such, what should be a solid character ends up coming out wobbling like a jelly. However, it does still apply here in computer animation. And one of the places where I would actually say it's more important to make sure that you're following it isn't in the animation itself, it's actually in the modelling side, specifically when you are modelling morphs into a character. In CG, modelling is the closest analogue to drawing, and if when you are making morphs for a character, either for a corrective morph for something or perhaps for a face shape, as we see here, then you do of course need to make sure that you are following the principle of solid drawing, so that changes in one aspect of a character also reflect in others, and you get this overall maintained volume and you don't wind up with a jelly character. So there we have it. That's our run through the basic principles of animation. Some of you may have noticed that there's a couple there that I haven't quite touched on. We'll just take a look at those in separate videos as those principles really start to exit the collection of principles for us and really do start to work into workflow and other approaches that are very important in the business of the animation we will be doing.